Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon or evening if you're attending from online somewhere in a time zone I can't calculate right now. I'm Titus Winters, Senior Principal Scientist at Adobe, focusing on developer experience. And this is going to be a little bit different than what you might expect. I'm going to warn you right now, there is no code in this talk, so if you are terribly disappointed, we still have 2 minutes for you to get up and leave. I suppose it's cliche and maybe a little bit on the nose, but I do feel I have to lead with this. Putting together a talk like this is kind of terrifying. Well, I mean, what I propose to do here is to stand here in front of a few hundred people, mostly strangers, and talk for an hour or so. And that description alone would be enough to make a lot of people panic. What's worse is that I intend to speak to an audience of programming language experts and C++ enthusiasts, the hardcore performance-oriented hackers and software engineers, and to talk about feelings. How do I get myself into these things? If I'm being honest, fear has been on my mind a lot lately. I changed jobs about a year ago, leaving Google after 13 years. And the idea of stepping away from a company and a role that defined my career, that forced me to learn basically everything I know about software engineering at scale, that's not an easy step to take. Joining another company, Adobe, and stepping up to lead efforts at modernizing engineering process and tools for more than 10,000 engineers, that's daunting, to say the least. I mean, I have no regrets, but I do have a lot of anxiety. Like, I'm shaking here. Am I good enough? What if I fail? Am I overcommitting? Am I stretching myself too thin? Am I setting myself up for burnout and misery? What if my new manager or my new colleagues at Adobe just want different things than what I know how to do? What if they really just want me to sit down, stop talking, and just go back to coding? Who am I to make suggestions to try to improve a company that was solid and successful when I was a teenager? So yeah, I've spent a lot of time thinking about fear lately. And obviously, I don't think that I'm unique in this in any way. In the audience, I expect we have people that are just learning C++, and learning complicated things like this can be scary. We've got first-time speakers, I assume, and that's going to be scary. Travel by itself can be scary. Being out, in public with a large crowd during, as Jens says, there is still a pandemic. Those are scary things. Speaking up in a crowd can be scary. And let's face it, the whole world around us seems a little bit darker than I would have guessed a decade ago. Nationalism, armed invasions, global pandemics, climate change, economic turmoil, mass migration, political unrest, fear. I think there is a lot more of that going on in our lives than we are necessarily admitting to ourselves. It's just a constant background at this point. So why do I want to use this stage to talk about fear at a tech conference of all places? I find that I'm drawn to this for a few reasons. First, I worry about what we treat as normal for the broader C++ community and for events like this. There are dozens of C++ conferences now, and that's great. But as I have said for years, a language is just a tool. It is one thing for us to study new techniques and design for our tools, like saws or hammers or whatever, but it is a very different thing for us to study how to use those as part of our craft overall. And if we're trying to improve our craft, that's a somewhat different thing than just studying hammers and saws. For some people, language expertise, whether in C++ or anything else, might be the goal in and of itself. If you just love it, and you are approaching your interest not as utility, but as fandom, that can be a really powerful motivator to learn and grow, and there is some room for that, within reason. But I expect that for most of us, technical material and the sorts of learning opportunities that we get at a conference is a means to an end. We're trying to be better programmers, developers, or engineers. And especially if you, like me, see engineering as programming times time times people, spending the majority of our effort only on the how do I get better at creating new code and inventing new things programming side of this feels like not the optimal way to approach career growth. So I'm putting my personal energy and credibility toward the people side of this equation. From what I can tell, the research backs me up on this. Google's research, which you can find if you search for Project Aristotle, that research on what makes teams successful was really enlightening for me. And the story goes that the research team, I think this was back in like '06, the research team and the management that sponsored that work assumed that the secret to high-performing teams would be brilliant engineers, a good manager, and infinite resource availability. And after studying 250 potential root causes to explain the variance in team outcomes, they completely discarded that hypothesis. None of those things hold up statistically. Instead, the most critical indicator of success in teams is just the idea of psychological safety. Team members need to be safe to take risks and be vulnerable around one another. We're going to come back to this point later, but I want to be very clear. There is a decade, more like 15 years worth of very consistent research in tech that says how we treat each other is a better indicator of technical success than language depth or IDE jockeying skills. There is minor evidence that our approach to documentation may be slightly more fundamental in predicting team success, but at root, both of those things come down to the type of culture that we are building in our frontline development teams. And a good culture, a psychologically safe culture, an environment of learning and growth, an environment of openness and inclusion, is a culture that takes active effort, not just passive avoidance of the types of behavior that's going to get you in trouble with HR. Right? So if we're going to conferences to learn to be better engineers, to further our career, I think we have to address the cultural side of that equation with awareness that teamwork and psychology and all of the rest of that. And that means recognizing that we are humans, we have emotions, and fear is a big one. So I'll be very clear about it. The best teams that I've ever been on were the ones that distinctly had the least fear and the most trust in my teammates. And the worst teams were the ones where people, myself included, were afraid of being mocked or punished for an honest mistake, not fitting in, or not knowing something that everyone else on the team knows, or in many cases, not knowing something that one jerk on the team knows. I'd also like to make a couple of meta points about talks like this, that is, talks about people. The first time that I put together a talk on social issues and teamwork was even more terrifying. I have been doing this now for a few years. But it became one of the presentations that I reprised more often than anything else, because I find that the lessons in good teamwork and the lessons in a good leadership talk are evergreen. From what I can see, these are the ones that often hit home the hardest. These are the ones that are going to get an emotional response, that are going to get passed around when they hit. But they are a lot of work, and they are scary. And there are also a couple interesting systemic issues at play here. So, for example, looking at the schedule for this conference, CPPCon, ACCU, C++ on C, and C++ Now, which are just the first 5 C++ conferences that came to mind. And this is not scientific. I did not watch every one of those talks. But I went through all of the talk titles for all of those conferences for the last year, and it appears that Meeting C++ has 3 talks that are about people. There's this one by me. Peter just described. He's doing one on the software engineering requirements. And Kate Gregory is probably around here somewhere and is talking about the aging programmer. Right? People talks. CPPCon had 2 talks about people things, one of which was open content, so maybe half credit. There was Improving Your Teamwork by Callum Piper, and Designing a C++ Code Generator, Guardrails by Sherry Sontag and Phoebe Bailey. ACCU had 6. Bravo for that. That is not a huge conference, including 2 keynotes. There's Learning is Teaching is Sharing by Bjorn Fowler, Surveying the C++ Community by Anastasia Kazakova, Mob, Pair, or Fly Solo by Chris Oldwood, Building Consensus by Sherry Sontag, Demystifying the Committee by Nina Rams, and Coping with Other People's Code by my new colleague, Laura Savino. C++ on C doesn't look like it had anything about people. If I misread that, I apologize. I don't mean to cast aspersions, but looks like it's more technical. And C++ Now had one. It's the Building Consensus talk by Sherry, once again. Do we notice anything? kind of jumps out to me that there are at least as many women as men speaking on this, especially Sherry's actually 3 of those talks. Anecdotally, looking out at this room, that is not what I would expect when we look at gender balance in the industry at large, C++ in specific, or even the speaker lists at conferences. This makes me a little sad and uncomfortable, especially because there is a common notion that in spaces that are suffering from issues with diversity and inclusion, it's the members of underrepresented demographics that do the heavy lifting when it comes to how do we work as a community. So thank you to everyone, regardless of gender or demographics, that is talking about people things in spaces like these. And as a person with a little bit of accrued credibility and respect, here is my somewhat delayed entry into that canon. And this itself touches on fear in a couple of ways. It is much easier to talk about a purely technical thing because you can look up the rules for SFINE or ADL. For teamwork, culture, or human stuff, it is a lot harder to tell what is objective truth. And the things that we believe to be true are generally less universal. There are cultural contexts and, psychological norms. It is really easy to write a bad talk, regardless of topic, and just as it is challenging to write a good talk. But it is meaningfully scarier to write something where there isn't an official arbiter of correctness. Stand in front of a few hundred people and cite some research without having read all of the research, because how would you even do that? Tell some personal stories, which might not generalize, because I know my experience is not the same as any of yours, and ask an audience to reconsider their basic interactions. This type of work is scary, and it is deeply unfair that the majority of that burden is being shouldered by people that are already told, as Jens just said, you don't look like a programmer. So today I want to talk about fear, especially the pervasive role of fear in the tech industry. And I think this manifests in a few major forms, all of which are worth keeping in mind. If our success and if our careers in software engineering depend on our handling of relationships and other people, and we know that the world is a pretty scary place, it seems like it makes sense to call out where these emotions might be preventing us from success, from communication, from collaboration, and from getting a job done. We're going to touch on reducing fear in our teams as a boost to higher performance. This is psychological safety, and it is critical in executing our jobs well and handling teamwork. It's reducing fear when using our technical systems, also as a boost to performance. Tools that give us more insight into what is going on or that can offer predictions of safety, I believe are a great productivity boon, partly because they reduce our uncertainty and fear and anxiety. I think there is some point at which we have to recognize that there is some inherent fear and uncertainty in our field. I don't think it is an accident that, from my perspective, we are extra prone to feeling imposter syndrome and generalized fear and anxiety in our field. And I don't think that we want to overly activate our lizard-brained emotional response, but there are going to be places where it is kind of just inherent in the task, and we should try to name and recognize and accept those things so that we can try to manage that appropriately. And finally, the role of fear, false understanding, hype, and FOMO in the industry at large, and especially in larger organizations. And of course, we'll talk about tools for fighting back against fear. Learning, trust, understanding. Some of this is certainly my bias, but I think a lot of fear and anxiety in our field arise from just not having a complete understanding of what is going on around us and not feeling like we have complete control. So let's dive into these things. As I said a few minutes ago, psychological safety is at the root of productivity for teams. Project Aristotle found that, and for the last decade or so, we also have signal in the research from DORA, the DevOps Research Association, originated with the book Accelerate, and they publish a State of DevOps report every year. It is well worth looking into. The DORA research says it in no uncertain terms. Culture is foundational. Since there are many ways to classify and characterize good culture, the lenses that any given research group uses will be a little different, and they will describe slightly different terminology. But in broad strokes, there is a lot of similarity between these things, and what Dora describes as a safe, productive cultural environment in terms of the Westrom research on organizational culture. Although it is very much a spectrum, there are three major modes of dynamics in the Westrom view. There is the power-oriented organization, team, company, whatever. This is do what I say because I said so. An environment based on power forces us to keep our heads down, avoid attention, don't cause trouble. This sort of environment tends towards shooting the messenger and how dare you communicate outside the chain of command. For those in power, this might feel great, but there is no evidence whatsoever that this type of environment is particularly productive, especially in a creative field like tech. For those not in power, this is certainly going to be an environment just riddled with fear. If you are constantly afraid of being fired, yelled at, or blamed for things going wrong, whether it's your fault or not, it is natural that your coping strategies are going to be a lot of risk avoidance. Let's just play it safe, not make waves, the boss is watching. That is probably not a recipe for creativity or innovation or success. There's the rules-oriented environment. This is do what the rules say because it's a bureaucracy. If the rules are clear and accessible to all and consistently applied, this can still be substantially better than a power-oriented environment. There is less fear involved if it is done well, but we still tend to not get great results. In theory, everyone is going to be graded and judged by how well they did what the rules say they're supposed to do, which may or may not be what actually needs to be done. And if the rules are counterproductive at all, or they need updating, this is going to be a trap. Finally, Westrom describes an outcomes-oriented environment. It says, do what we need to do to achieve an objective. There may still be someone with power, and there may still be rules, but within reason, you might choose to ignore these things in service of a greater goal. Importantly, systems like this require psychological safety, and they are substantially higher productivity over time because without having access to running those type of experiments where I've just ignored the rules for a while, it is really hard for the rules to ever change or the people in power to learn anything new about where their decisions might have been wrong. This sort of culture, however, takes very active effort, a lot of energy. We need everyone to be bought into a vision of a shared outcome. We need high levels of trust. And we need enough communication and learning to really know why our things are the way they are, whether that's policy or technical system. We need to know why the rules are in place. We need to know what we are optimizing for. And without that sort of environment to operate in, we're going to make stupid mistakes repeatedly, the same thing over and over again, as people try things without sharing the lessons of their failures. And this is going to make it really hard for an organization to ever evolve to meet changing demands. Now, the Dora research doesn't say why an outcomes-focused culture or any culture is important, but the research there does give a sense of how much it matters. Holding other foundational elements stable, that is, you have the same technical practices, et cetera, we're only varying the cultural response. Something like 30% of organizational success is accounted for by teams with this sort of culture. I'll put that another way. For whatever goals your team, product, organization, or company happen to set, knowing whether or not this culture is in place on your frontline teams accounts for 30% of the result, positive or negative. That's huge. And the only thing that Dora has found that appears to be statistically meaningful influence to contribute to that number, or to culture, is documentation. Documentation itself influences culture. And my favorite theory for that influence is because when we write things down, we put everyone on the team and in the company on equal footing, and we take away some of that fear. Now, this is probably less true for your user-facing product docs, the API documentation, et cetera, but it is very true for those docs that you are probably ignoring the most, the team internal material. Your onboarding docs, your how do I do my first build, how do I run CI, what are our norms around code review, what's our style guide. For most teams, there are a huge number of unspoken, unwritten rules and out-of-date infrastructure instructions. Fixing those is critical in helping reduce the level of anxiety for the team and making it possible for new people to onboard. I once caught a talk by Dr. John A. Powell of the Belonging Institute in Berkeley, and I wish I had the precise quote, but he said something along the lines of, all groups of humans have values. If the group doesn't discuss those values, we find the safe strategy to be to act more defensively, even if the group at large would support a stronger stance. That is, if you and everyone around you might secretly think that the team would be better off if you adopted a different practice. But if you don't discuss your beliefs, the safe thing is to just play it safe, not make waves. The group psychology literature backs all of this up. We substantially overestimate how likely we are for a new idea to cause conflict in the group, as well as how severe that conflict would be, even if there was conflict. For more on this, you could also search for perceived consensus. There's tons of psychology research on all these things. And this leads me directly to some culture homework for your teams. Please do this next week. I'm not joking. Learn to have discussions about your values. Importantly, you might not want to start with the big, scary discussions of the things that really matter, like diversity, equity, inclusion. For a lot of engineers, those are scary for good reason. And it would be a lot safer to start with discussions of technical values. Those are still values. What level of quality are we aiming for in this software? What do we expect from each other in code review? Or my favorite values discussion on training wheels, how do we treat the campsite rule? The campsite rule is shorthand for the idea that we need to leave things, our code or the campsite that we're staying at, in better shape than we found it. This is a popular buzzword in my circles, but it's exactly the sort of technical value that illustrates Dr. Powell's point. We can say that we like a thing like this, but still wind up brushing it off and not really following through. So I recommend this as starter homeworks for your team. Set aside some time to discuss your values and start with the campsite rule. Give a hypothetical. I spent one full day poking around at System X in order to fix this bug or implement this feature. And now that I know what I'm doing, it could have been done in 2 hours. How much campsite improvement is expected of me in this scenario? If you do not have an explicit discussion, people are going to pay lip service to the idea that it is important to tidy some stuff up, but it's safest to move on to just fix the next bug. If you have this discussion, most teams are going to decide that it would be better to spend an hour or two of drive-by cleanup in exchange for that day of digging around. Then apply that same sort of drive-by cleanup strategy to your whole working environment, your docs, your engineering process, all of it. Once you've had those discussions, all of this focus on culture becomes a simple matter of documentation. Write down what you agree to. Make it clear what team members are expected to hold each other accountable for. Some groups will call this a team working agreement or a team culture doc. Put it in Markdown, host it alongside your important projects, get input from new hires, and get them to commit themselves to it as well. Refer to it regularly and update it as needed. Make it clear that it is by the team, for the team, and make it a space for writing down all the unspoken stuff. What hours do we expect you to be available for a meeting or on Slack? What's the procedure for ducking out early to pick up a sick kid or to go to the doctor? Does the team go to lunch together? If so, who picks the restaurant? How do you run meetings? What's the expected response time for a code review? How much of your time is yours versus the team's? If you want to spend 10 minutes reading about how to accomplish a task, that should be okay on every team. But if you wanted to spend 10 days full-time in classes learning something, you probably want to ask for permission and have a little bit of discussion with the team before committing to that. Where's the cutoff between those things for your team? Discuss these things and write them down. Because for every person that is bold enough to just go do it, there is someone on the team that's afraid to even ask, or that is frustrated that they don't have these same freedoms afforded to them. Or they're afraid of holding the line for anything in code review because everyone else seems to just treat code review as a rubber stamp. Without learning to codify your values and have your team hold themselves to a higher standard, we will never get better. And I worry that without psychological dynamics tricks like this, we don't even know how to grant ourselves permission to do better. And that question of permission has haunted me for a while now. A couple years ago, I was co-teaching classes on software design and software testing focused on mid-career team leads. These were often people that were newly minted in those leadership positions, and it really surprised me because they felt like they all had enough technical depth to lead. They didn't disagree that they should have been put in that new leadership position, but they often reported a lot of fear and uncertainty about what the rest of their responsibilities looked like, what powers they had at their disposal. In retrospect, that kind of makes sense for what we expect in tech. I am a nerd. I play a lot of role-playing games and things like that. And when you level up in a game, you are told what your new powers are, right? Oh, hey, you got new hit points. You got new spells, right? That's good, right? When you level up in tech, no one tells you anything. You're like, congratulations, you're in charge. No definition of what that means. Have fun. We also don't tell those newly minted leaders how they're going to be evaluated, right? Are you evaluated in the same way that you were last month before you got that new leadership role? Or are you being evaluated now for how does the rest of the team grow? Are you looking at this week's output, or are you looking at output 6 months from now, right? We need to be much clearer about those things. This study brings to mind two results from one of my favorite researchers. Dr. Kat Hicks has been studying psychology in tech and produced several brilliant results recently. The first was drawn from in-depth interviews looking at the qualitative differences in teams that prioritize building a learning culture. For teams that don't, Dr. Hicks coined the really scary phrase learning debt. And her summary of that terrifies me and makes me sad for the industry at large. Themes from these interviews revealed an important learning tension. The work that code writers needed to do to understand code often did not feel like what was rewarded in the evaluation of their work. Code review often did not recognize code writers' effort when it did not result in lines of code. And despite any stated ideals about knowledge sharing, either documentation is good or collaboration is valued, this work was often contradicted with negative cues from colleagues about what is truly valued. This tension is exacerbated by code writers' fears about not looking like an engineer and their desire to perform to the expectations of their environment. Code writers navigated this by divesting from their own learning and from the invisible work of knowledge transfer. That is a fancy way of saying they're just not writing comments or documentation or, they're just phoning it in. And they leave their future collaborators with no guidance in their own ramp up to unfamiliar code. As a result, code writers frequently expressed a poignant loneliness, even in very well-funded teams. This maladaptive cycle is what we call learning debt. Let me be perfectly blunt and put together some ideas from the last 10 minutes. If at least 30% of your team outcomes can be explained by building up an outcomes-focused culture of learning, but there are people on your team that feel like writing comments or asking clarifying questions in code review will make them not look like an engineer, that's a problem. I believe very fundamentally that our entire mental image of what a software engineer looks like is bogus. A lone coder in a dark room late at night? No. Many of us with formal training in CS or software engineering were given this implicitly in college or university because of the rules of getting an undergraduate degree. Collaborating on code is cheating. You have to do the work yourself so that we can grade you. Nobody is ever going to see your code except professors or graders when they dig in to judge you. And honestly, most of our professors are not programming live in front of us, so it's not like we ever witness anyone else coding either. So our formal training in all of this is that we study programming for 4 or 5 years. We rarely, if ever, witness someone else program, and generally never have anyone else look at our code except to judge us. And then we go to our first jobs in industry. No one tells us how to work on a team, or that the requirement is that we do work on a team, and that we share our ideas early and often and get feedback quickly and learn from each other. So we fall back on that initial training. We're being judged. We're expected to do it alone. Our code is shame. This brings us to another piece of Dr. Hicks's work that blew my mind. One question she asked was, is technical effort truly seen? She asked managers, making my team's technical work and effort seen in my organization is a fundamental part of my job, right? We want to be evaluating whether people are doing the hard, important work. 88% of managers agreed. Like, they need to know what their people are doing in order to represent it fairly and have those discussions. Among developers, 24% believe that their manager has sufficient visibility into their work to do the job of being a manager. What sort of behavior should we expect if less than a quarter of our colleagues believe that their manager, the person that has authority over compensation, promotion, task assignment, has any useful visibility into their work? Personally, I would expect that we get a lot of performative actions, a lot of sound and fury signifying nothing, and a whole lot less focus on anything that actually matters. We get power and rules-oriented environments and vastly less outcomes-focused behavior. Dr. Hicks dug into this further, asking people to characterize what productivity means in the context of their team. So I want you to think about this. Think about a moment where you felt like you were really deeply productive. I would hope that when you described that moment, you would get answers like, yeah, we were just making all of the problems go away. We were producing stuff that would solve this, like implement this feature at high quality. This is code that's going to last. We're building engineering quality that's appropriate for the lifespan of our code. Instead, the top responses that we get are things like, productivity is hard. If it doesn't feel hard, it doesn't matter. I think that those are maybe correlated, but not the same thing. Productivity is never stopping. Don't take breaks. Don't do things that are off task. Always be focusing. If you're not putting in a 12-hour-a-day grind, you're not being productive. There's 50 years of research that says we get, there's a substantial productivity drop-off at about 30 hours a week, right? If you're actually trying to actively hack for 60 hours, you're doing it wrong. Productivity is lonely. Going back to that university training, if we're not doing it alone, it's not productive. These descriptions make me incredibly sad. And I truly hope that none of you want these to be the answers, because these are not good answers. I see how we got here, but I'm not even sure that there is a positive correlation between some of these and actually solving meaningful problems. Dr. Hicks calls this brittle productivity, and that description hit me in the feelings the first time I heard it. Of course, we are going to resort to doing things that look hard if we don't think our manager has visibility into what we're doing. But the things that look hard are not necessarily the things that are going to matter the most. So the name of the game when we talk about fear and uncertainty in frontline teams is about increasing shared understanding, highlighting invisible work, building learning cultures, and avoiding the sort of performative nonsense that leads us to worship at the altar of brittle productivity. We want results that matter, not activities that look hard from a distance. To that end, I'm a big fan of 2 rituals that you can add to team meetings in service of fostering visibility, improving recognition, trust, and respect. The first is simple, just kudos. Just put it in your standing meeting agenda for your team, right? And you have a chance for everyone on the team to call out the good invisible work. Someone did an extra thorough code review? Thank them. Someone covered an on-call shift because you had a sick kid? Let the team know. Someone reviewed your design or suggested something you could reuse, saving you weeks worth of redundant development effort? Share that story with the group. Because we're never going to get to the point that managers do know all of the things that we did that matter, even on a small team. So if you want the collective to value your invisible work, you need to make others' work visible. And it's a lot safer when you call out that work for others instead of just doing it yourself. I support self-praise as well, that's fine. but it's going to feel a lot easier and better and be a better group dynamic if you're calling out the work of others. But you absolutely need to be focusing on this. And there's, again, decades of research on this type of thing. Public gratitude is good for social bonding and good for us. It's good for your spirit. It's good for your soul. Second, my teams follow kudos with an exercise that we call the monkey. This is self-nominations for the biggest mistake of the week. Tell the story of what you messed up. Tell the story of the thing that you didn't understand, the compiler bug that haunted you. Do it as soon as you can so that everyone else can also learn that lesson early and cheaply. Software is hard, y'all, and mistakes are inevitable. If we can make expensive mistakes only once per team instead of once per person, that is a massive savings. But this only works in an environment where we are focused more on learning from an honest, novel mistake rather than one of blame-shifting, excuses, and hiding our shames. Teams that actively build a good culture are more productive because they take away the fear and let you focus on the stuff that actually matters. Good culture lets us focus on real productivity and important outcomes rather than just performative acts of looking busy. Good culture fosters learning, meaning that the team will be better next year. But it all starts with very simple things: learning to talk to each other, saying what we value, and following through on our promises to one another. We must have those discussions, and you probably ought to write down the results so that everyone on the team, as well as new people that onboard later, can be operating on the same footing. Communication, values discussions, team working agreements, and a focus on learning and growth are not luxuries. These are fundamental tools in driving out fear, building culture as a step towards real, lasting, resilient productivity. And lest we think that fear only has ramifications in communications, teamwork, and social things, I also think that there is an interesting perspective on some classes of our tools as fear reducers. Specifically, tools that we use to establish a formal source of truth and shared understanding reduce the anxiety level for some people. Things like version control, CI, and monitoring systems all improve and reduce, or even eliminate, the potential for confusion and misunderstanding. With tools like these in place and used well, we reduce, oh, are you even using the current version? And we can usually eliminate, well, it worked on my machine, right? These are really scary sorts of things to fall into the trap of, especially for junior engineers. Monitoring and alerting move us from anxiously refreshing the homepage and hoping that everything is still up, towards a model where we carry a pager and brace ourselves for interrupts, but largely we can just wait until the system tells us that something is wrong. This also means we avoid the boss yelling at us, "Why didn't you notice it was down sooner?" And we can give ourselves a clearer set of requirements for what it means to do our job. Make sure those alerts don't fire. Respond as soon as possible when they do. Otherwise, feel free to go about your business. And I think there's a lot to be said for a subset of these tools, the ones that increase consistency and provide predictions. One of the single most important behaviors from CI is the ability to run a subset of your tests pre-merge. There is no guarantee that our changes will actually still work after merging. There are some complicated proofs in all of that. But that pre-merge testing is a high-value oracle. We're using that technology to predict the future. It is an imperfect prediction, but we agree that it is the best that we have. So we want to establish a technical bar for the type of testing that needs to be done ahead of time for any given change, and thus we take it out of the realm of, well, I thought I tested it enough, or even worse, I wasn't brave enough to submit, so I sat on the change for too long, and now it's out of sync and everything needs to be redone. The most successful tools in tech are the ones that allow us to predict the result of a change. CI and CD systems can take complicated human judgment questions out of the picture and put us on a level playing field. They are reducing fear and providing productivity in the same way that a team working agreement does. One is very social and one is very technical, but they are both very valuable tools. If we have technical systems that help reduce the fear and anxiety in our jobs, do we have systems that increase fear? Of course we do. Most of us have them. Those are those weird legacy systems that are too complicated to work with. They're full of dust and cobwebs and the ghosts of developers past. SRE has a wonderful term for these systems, haunted graveyards. And a very simple rule about haunted graveyards. No haunted graveyards. The great SRE thinker John Rees, aka JTR, has a really lovely lightning talk on this, which I'm basically cribbing entirely here. It is easy in this line of work to become superstitious. This part of the system is risky, let's not touch it. That's a haunted graveyard. We should invade and reconsecrate any area that is showing signs of turning into a haunted graveyard. John is right here, and elsewhere, but here too. Engineering is hard, but it is about making rational trade-offs. If we are afraid, that is triggering a bunch of lizard brain emotions that are not serving us well in making rational decisions. This is not to say that we have to fix everything that is risky. A bit of understood and accepted risk is fine. But for haunted graveyards, by habituating the workarounds instead of getting any understanding of the system, we're putting ourselves at a greater risk, an unnecessary risk. And as John says, these cases are all too common. It's the race condition you usually win. It's putting functionality in the wrong place because you aren't confident you can do it in the right place. It's leaving sharp edges on the API because you aren't sure who might be using it and what might happen if you touch it. It's the legacy system that just no one will touch until someone gives up and rewrites the whole thing from scratch. John says, our job is control, not to avoid danger at all costs. Things that you are afraid to change are serious existential risks. This is all being presented in very SRE terms, but I have been saying similar things on the software engineering side of things for almost a decade now. I've leaned on this definition of software sustainability, which made it into the very front bits of the Flamingo book. Your project is sustainable if, for the expected lifespan of your software, you are capable of reacting to whatever valuable change comes along for either technical or business reasons. Importantly, we're only looking for capability. You might choose not to perform a given upgrade, either for lack of perceived value or for other priorities. But when you are fundamentally incapable of reacting to a change in underlying technology or product direction, then you are placing a high-risk bet on the hope that such a change never becomes critical. For very short-term projects, say your next iOS app that you're probably going to throw away in 2 years, that might be a safe bet. Over a project with multiple decades behind it, it probably isn't. And I see two major ways that we lose on sustainability. We can make one-way doors. This is an Amazon term. These are decisions that can't be undone. If you make a technical decision that you can't walk back, you're not going to be entirely sustainable. C++ accidentally committing to ABI stability kind of comes to mind. Too soon. We can also say letting fear creep in and creating a haunted graveyard out of our system. Both are harmful, but a haunted graveyard legacy system is only haunted because of a lack of understanding, experience, and tools. It's hard work, but it's fixable. Legacy systems are not the only place where our field is rife with fear. I think a lot of our mainstream strategies and behavior in tech also have fear as kind of a major root cause. And I would even argue that it is, in fact, inherent to our field. Most of the interesting work in tech is the stuff that I would argue can just barely be done. Because if it was substantially easier than that, we would already have automated it away. And if it was harder, we will fail. All of the technical infrastructure that we have built up over the last 5 decades, from programming languages, UI frameworks, operating systems, databases, serverless orchestration systems, all of these things serve to let us handle ever-increasing challenge and complexity, which also means it's pretty reasonable for people to spend their entire careers doing things they can just barely do. That does sound exhausting, right? The last major point of discussion today is the role of posturing, hype, anxiety, and fear in tech as an industry. We are an industry that will happily confuse, I fear, speed for velocity. Going real fast in some direction is very appealing to us, even if the right answer is moderate speed in the right direction. Performative work and activity measures are a comfortable stand-in for thinking, understanding, and actually solving problems in a sustainable fashion. This gets right back to brittle productivity. Because of our desire to do performative work, to look busy, to look like we are going fast regardless of where we are headed, we wind up missing a lot of basic details. For instance, a lot of the time we don't even stop to understand the vocabulary around us. New terms are thrown at us all the time, and we don't stop to get definitions, relying instead on our ability to glean a rough understanding from context. How many of you ever had someone sit down to you and explain what semver did? One. Yeah, see? This is kind of how the industry works. We're extracting our context from someone that had just done the same thing, and they had just learned it from context from someone else, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? I suspect this is part of why, as an industry, we are terrible at precision terminology. And then a new technology lands every year or two, throwing in a whole new bunch of buzzwords and keywords, promising revolution, and we set off on yet another hype cycle. Usually, those cycles come without even the basic understanding needed for handling a new tool. What is it good for, and what is it not good for? By this point, it probably comes as no surprise. I think that we get into these hype cycles to some extent because of fear. Both fear of letting others know that you aren't the smartest, hippest, most on trend, so we never stop to ask, what is that term? What is that tech about? What's it good for? What's it bad for? And then just the basic FOMO. If everyone else is jumping off the AI bridge, shouldn't we? Won't we look silly by waiting it out? The cure for this sort of fear, I would argue, once again, is learning and understanding. When reviewing a proposal, especially a proposal to adopt a new tech, personally, I look for three main things. How will this work over time? This is what does maintenance look like? How do we handle upgrades? How do we think about version skew, schema evolution, data consistency, et cetera? This is going back to that idea of engineering as programming times time times people. This is the time part. You have to understand the time ramifications in order to have a software engineering solution. Otherwise, you just have a programming solution. Similarly, the people side of it. How does this affect people? How does this work with more or different people? Can we scale up? What's the cost for newcomers to adopt the system? How will this work when there's a reorg and the team is split in two, or when the lead maintainer retires? And finally, what is this good for and what is it not good for? Compared to what we already have, what use cases does this work for, and what are we trading off? What scenarios do we have where a potential new user shouldn't use the new thing? In some cases, you might be able to skip asking maybe one of these questions as irrelevant, but you should be thinking really carefully before you make that sort of claim. So let's take a second to run through an example of this mindset. The hot topic of the day seems to be generative AI. So imagine we turn back the clock 2 years or so, and rather than assuming that LLMs will automate away everything, we dig into it enough to answer the above questions. How does this work over time? Well, if we know that LLMs require training on a ton of data, that sounds like it ought to incentivize us to have access to big, high-quality data sets. Reddit has a lot of text with some ratings already applied to it. Stock photography sites have a lot of licensed images with metadata. But if generative AI can auto-generate stuff that looks like it came from the training set, maybe we need to be careful about not polluting the training set. Oops. How does this affect people? Turns out it largely just freaks people out. And a lot of people fear that they are about to be obsoleted. And this leads to some wild decision-making. In fact, going back a little ways, Dr. Hicks even has work showing that the frequency of software engineers that are afraid of losing their job is more than to AI, is more than twice as high in environments without strong team culture and environment of learning. 44% of the general industry somehow believes that AI is coming for their job, versus about 20% on teams where you are valued as a human. If we take the time to see what is good and bad about this tech and how to adopt the good bits, and we trust that we are seen as having value as a person, we're a lot less likely to freak out when a program seems to be a decent programmer, even when it is only a stochastic parrot. What is this good for and what is it not good for? At several conferences over the last year, I have tried to ask the AI speakers, what is your mental model for what this can and cannot do? And sadly, their answers tend to be pretty buzzwordy and low on content. The single best bit of thinking that I have seen on this came from almost 2 years ago and came from, of all places, substantially outside of the tech press. The sci-fi author Ted Chiang, who's a great writer, by the way, some of the best short stories out there, right? He also does occasionally write about tech, and in a piece in The New Yorker, Ted Chiang produced the best mental model for generative AI that I have found so far. It is a piece entitled ChatGPT is a blurry JPEG of the web. And if you have not read it, go read it. This is the idea that LLMs are a lossy compression over the input corpus with a funny sort of query and extraction interface. That's it. For common tasks, you are going to get roughly the average of the input corpus. For entirely novel things, you get a roll of the dice, hallucination, or complete misunderstanding. Importantly, because it is a lossy compression, it is preternaturally able to convince us that it is somehow smart, because of a basic fact of how we as humans learn. When I teach you something and you parrot it back to me in my own words, I do not believe that you have learned anything. You are just rote repetition, right? But if you repeat it in your own words, that is a signifier somehow that you have achieved your own understanding. I trust that you have learned the material. Because of it being a lossy compression inherent in LLMs, they have no choice but to use their own words. The original token string is lost, right? We've built these things to hack us into believing that they are smart, when really what they are doing is rote repetition and query retrieval. We see the power of this sort of mindset to explain a lot of the stories that we get about generative AI. LLM models are meaningfully better at producing useful results when trained on a corpus of textbooks rather than the internet at large. Turns out random dogs on the internet probably shouldn't be answering most of your questions. Results are better when you are polite because including the magic words please and thank you filters out chunks of the internet where the trolls live. I learned this one from Bryce. You get better results auto-generating source code in languages that almost nobody uses because the average code snippet on the internet is written by someone more eager or expert. It might actually be the weirdo that invented the language, right? Again, there are a lot of dogs on the internet, as it were. Or, going back to being a nerd, try getting an AI art generator to generate something that isn't well represented in the training set. I play a fair amount of D&D, but my friends and me are in our 30s and 40s. Try getting RPG character art of a 40-year-old woman. Wizard. Sure, we'll do wizard. Turns out character art is all young, beautiful people or grandmothers. Not a lot of middle-aged adventurers in the training data, and it shows. I am married to a 40-year-old woman. These are not her. None of this is to say that Gen AI isn't valuable. I use it on at least a weekly basis in one form or another, but between Fred Brooks, author of the Mythical Man Month essays, and No Silver Bullet, versus Sam Altman, I'm going with Brooks. There is no silver bullet. No single advancement in a decade is going to give us a 10x productivity boost. This round of AI is not doing it. Everyone take a breath. It is really handy for very rote activities that are well represented in the training data. Even the research out of GitHub from Copilot, there was a great piece in Communications of ACM. It was written by people at GitHub, researchers that I have known in the past. It was like, ooh, if you're arguing what the productivity impact of Copilot is as a GitHub researcher, how is this gonna go? Turns out it's an absolutely beautiful piece. And most of what they said is, these things are extremely good at getting junior engineers over the hurdle of getting their code to compile. And other than that, it is a moderate improvement on autocomplete. That's where we're at. But this is also going to cause a ton of chaos, generative AI, since the rest of the industry is completely unprepared for all of the effects stemming from we can generate moderate quality results for a huge number of media types, video, apps, code, whatever, things that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. The fear in tech around AI should not be, what if the hype is real and I'm left behind? You're going to be fine. It should instead be, how do we cope with the fact that everything on the internet is now corrupt? Our data sources are polluted by junk Gen AI feeds, and our feeds and editorial streams are being inflated by 10 or 100x. How do you filter out the decent content? How do you filter out the abusive content when it can be spat out at rapid rates? Stepping away from the AI specifics, I recognize that these are not the easiest questions to answer. But I think, importantly, we don't even have to be perfectly accurate to get some benefit here. Spending some time thinking about the nature of a new bit of tech and answering these questions is hopefully reassuring to us and should give us at least a little bit of resilience against the temptation to go all in on hype and panic and FOMO for whatever the next big thing will be. And I especially encourage people to ask, what is this not good for? You can tell an awful lot about whether to trust someone's sales pitch based on whether they can reasonably answer that question. And the last type of fear that I want to address is the way that tech organizations at large seem to panic at some ideas. In particular, it looks to me like tech is afraid of things that we cannot measure, can't classify, or can't control. We're afraid of acting without quantitative evidence, something that we can take an average of, to a level that kind of infuriates me. How often do you hear things like this? We can't improve it if we can't measure it. If we can't measure it, it doesn't matter. The plural of anecdote is not data. How will we prove our impact? All of these smell to me like the tech mindset of bogus objectivity and the belief that if we're just smart enough, we can quantify the whole world. Let's review the ways that this mindset does not work. There are things that matter that cannot be measured. How much do you love your family? If I ask you to prove that, is that me being objective? Or is that me being obnoxious? Who would know your feelings better than you? And yet, these are the type of questions we get from skeptical leadership. In short, this is a prime example of the McNamara fallacy. This is named after a semi-famous, infamous figure in the US in the early 70s, briefly ran Ford Motor Company and was also the Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War. The Wikipedia article on this is kind of terrifying. The instinct to focus on quantitative inputs comes and goes, but it certainly seems to be running rampant in tech. Rebuttals to this line of thinking are very common. The Wikipedia page for this, which surfaces this takedown for the mindset. The McNamara discipline is applied to literally. The first step is to measure whatever can be easily measured. The second step is to disregard that which can't be easily measured or given a quantitative value. The third step is to presume that what can't be measured easily really isn't important. And the fourth step is to say that that which can't be easily measured really doesn't exist. And this is suicide. Again, how much do you love your family? Or why do you like your favorite movie or TV show? Why is it your favorite? Under what metrics is it best? Not only are there things that can't be measured, a lot of the most important stuff in life can't be. The plural of anecdote is not data. And I agree with this technically, but in spirit, I find that there is a lot more nuance and information to be gained in a big bucket of anecdotes than there is from a mountain of bad survey data. In fact, there are substantial branches of experimental empirical research that are based around how do we handle large amounts of non-numeric data? Our discipline would be substantially better off if we were better at understanding how to process data of all types and recognizing that non-numeric data might not be averageable, but still can be extremely valuable. What we are subjecting ourselves to as an industry by only focusing on numerics is a streetlight effect of sorts. If we can't get things reduced down to numbers and averages, we just don't bother looking there. For instance, consider taxonomies. If you're putting together a survey for your customers or your developers or whatever, what goes into making up the list of options that you have in that set of radio buttons or checkboxes? Or breaking down, say, the taxonomy of types of bugs that customers have reported. Most of us, I assume, just kind of make up something that kind of vibes. But there are actually formal methods to do this properly and to validate that your resulting taxonomies actually capture the span of resulting issues. And when we don't do that, I would argue that our taxonomies are largely technical debt. Every time we are using it, there is some friction. A very great instance of this. The Engineering Productivity Research Group at Google, led by Sierra Jaspin and Colin Green, did a study on what do developers mean when they complain about technical debt. Qualitative methods are how you properly produce and validate a taxonomy. Answer the question of what do they mean when they talk about this. In this case, one starts with interviews and free response questions. Then you get a group of readers and researchers to go through and bucket those things with no guidance on the number of buckets or bucket definitions. And you look for which elements get placed together within buckets that are the same from reader to reader. And you continue this with more readers until you wind up with some sort of statistical consensus. And then you have an actual reasonable taxonomy derived from data. In this case, they then validated that taxonomy by including it in developer surveys, along with an other box to see if there was anything that people were complaining about not represented in the taxonomy. And out of thousands and thousands of responses to the survey, vanishingly few people ever use other. So there is a taxonomy that captures technical debt. This is it. Tactically, my point here is that qualitative research methods are relevant, useful, and interesting. Strategically, my point is that there are things that matter and can be empirically validated even if there are not numbers. Getting over that mental hurdle is challenging, but I think it is also essential because our industry is kind of reductive. Not everything important can be measured, and measurement is not the only way to extract meaning from data or experience. Giving ourselves permission to care about things that haven't been quantified is important, but it takes some courage, especially when it seems like very few groups are doing that. The herd mentality in tech is just wild. Speaking of taxonomies and questions like how do we prove impact, I will close here with one of the great sources of fear in tech, systems with inherent emergent complexity. Started thinking about this after someone sent me an essay from 2010, a big little idea called legibility, which dives into a familiar-seeming recipe for large organizations. Look at a complex and confusing reality, such as the social dynamics of an old city or the technical complexity of managing a programming language. Fail to understand all of the subtleties of how that complex reality works. Attribute that failure to the irrationality of what you are looking at, rather than your own limitations. Come up with an idealized blank slate version of what that reality ought to look like. Argue that the relative simplicity and platonic orderliness of your vision of reality is what it actually ought to look like. And it represents rationality. Use authoritarian power to impose that vision, demolishing the old rationality, or reality if necessary, and then watch your faux rational utopia fail horribly. This is actually basically the story of most housing projects and designed from the top down towns and cities. You could get two ideas like this studying The Power Broker and Robert Moses or Jane Jacobs. You can get to this any number of ways. The story that is in fact most strongly associated with this line of thinking is that of scientific forestry in Europe, especially here in Germany, in the early 1900s. Government at the time was interested in maximizing tax revenue from their forests, but that requires being able to quantify a complex environment, acreage, yield, value. A native forest is a mix of valuable lumber, underbrush, animals, all sorts of things, in an inherently complex web of relationships. But most of that complexity is seen as being in the way of understanding timber resources. So of course the natural thing to do is just replant the forests, strip away all of that unnecessary, irrational complexity, and you just plant row after row of the highest yield timber with none of that other junk in the way. And the result is why we know that monocultures aren't healthy, ecosystems are robust, and monocultures are incredibly brittle. Anything that goes wrong will take out the entire environment. The big point in all of this is that when we look at an inherently complex environment, we have to have the courage to avoid the instinct to reduce that down into something understandable, legible. And this is especially true when the complexity is load-bearing in our capability of producing any value in our jobs. Another lens on the same idea is an even older essay from back in 1965. It's more explicit and might even be more relevant for programmers, resonant for programmers. A city is not a tree. The author, Christopher Alexander, is speaking of a tree in roughly the sense that we understand it from data structures. It's actually the set theory version of trees, but the trees in question are conceptual, and they capture the hierarchical dynamics and relationships between entities in a complex environment. If we look at how cities evolve naturally, there is a sort of fractal complexity, but it's one that actually works and is pleasant to live in. By comparison, cities that are designed top-down all exhibit a sort of tree structure relationship, hierarchically structured so that a few houses are a neighborhood, a few neighborhoods are a village, a few villages are a town, and bits of infrastructure assigned to those at a certain density. It's all quite legible. But the problem with this thinking is that relationships in a complex environment, community, organization, etc., are not hierarchical. I live in New York City, which is broken into 5 boroughs, and those boroughs have any number of neighborhoods within them. And you know what? I live in Queens, but I have relationships to other boroughs, restaurants in Brooklyn, an office in Manhattan, and every city resident is like that, with a different set of relationships. There is no proper hierarchy. The fact that I live in Queens and work in Manhattan does not mean that that same relationship is borne out for every other resident of Queens. The org chart, the same is true of software ecosystems or large companies. The org chart does not capture reality. The map is not the territory. False legibility will not get us there. Microsoft Research published a very nice thing along those lines, where they published coworker relationships based on meeting schedules and communication frequency. Swaths on this chart are of the same color report up to the same executive, and points that are closer based on communication signals. In a healthy environment, clearly the org chart has some influence on communication and collaboration, but there is a lot more to it than just the management hierarchy. A city is not a tree, a company is not either. The complexity of a software ecosystem, a large company, a forest, or a city is scary if we think of ourselves as in a position where we need to tame or manage or wrangle that complexity. And for the type of leader that we tend to idolize in tech, that vision of control does seem awfully seductive. The reality is, so many of our approaches to thinking about complicated problems are legibility gone wrong. They're reductive, they're oversimplified, they're distant. We reduce our complicated issues down to one number. Productivity is lines of code, or reputation is net promoter score. For a small single thing, that one app or one utility library, you might be able to find a good single representation of success. But when stuff is complicated, then pretending otherwise is just foolish, and it is just feeding our fears of not actually being in control. The brave approach is to recognize that software spawns complex ecosystems more regularly than other industries, and to just embrace the chaos. Don't oversimplify. Don't go for the reductive measure. Don't only rely on surveys or net promoter scores. Talk to people. Read reviews. Try to get vibes off of Reddit or YouTube or social media. None of those are the whole story, because there is nothing that you can gather that is, and admitting that takes courage. Through all of this rambling, hopefully I've been able to reinforce one important point. Although we think of this as the tech industry, and that we are about technology and computers, at root, we are still messy human creatures. We have feelings, we have anxieties. There are things we know and things that we don't know. Sometimes we're okay admitting when we don't know, but that is not nearly as frequent as it deserves to be. Because of the strange performative nature of tech and social media and brittle productivity, it's easy to believe that everyone around you has it figured out, and to convince ourselves that performative hustle and hype chasing and reductive legibility and bad taxonomies are the right answer. Everyone else is doing it, after all. But there is a better way. We need to admit that this is a human industry with substantially different outcomes for our businesses based on how we treat our humans. For frontline teams, learn from Project Aristotle, from Dr. Hicks, and the Dora research. Spend meaningful energy on actively building a positive culture. Make sure you get your docs updated, especially those internal ones that will unblock the new folks and the junior folks and the timid folks on your team. Have those values discussions. Write down what you want to hold yourselves to. Get your story straight on version control, testing, CI, CD, monitoring, and whatever other tech you can find that increases visibility, awareness, and a shared understanding of the state of things. Avoid the hype cycles by learning to ask questions about what is really going on. Don't be that guy that shows up to the crypto meetup promising to end human aging through crypto. that guy has clearly not asked what the underlying technology actually is or isn't. It's not actually even a joke. I mean, that guy is a joke. Have the courage to admit when a thing is not measurable or won't be quantifiable. Take some time, learn better statistical methods, and just maybe more critically, understand what qualitative methods might do for a more holistic understanding of the complexity that you are trying to classify. Learn to recognize when our measures or surveys or taxonomies are reductive. And pro tip, most of our taxonomies are just reductive. Assume that by default. Get comfortable admitting that we can't control or classify everything, and that the value of any given operation or a complicated project, a good team, a great company, a city, a forest, cannot be reduced down to a single measure. Our jobs are incredibly complicated, and there is a daunting amount of stuff to know out there. We should be kind to ourselves and to those around us, and be willing to admit when we don't know things, and that that's okay. We don't have to live in fear of being found out. We should celebrate our differences, the unique things that we bring to the job, and our humanity. Thank you. You're the first humans that heard that.
All right. Okay, this is on. So we do have questions, and if you want to have questions, then there's question microphones, and line up. I'll take the first question from the online world. Hani Sukasan asks, regarding tech likes control, what do you think about story point estimation for a creative industry like software engineering, and at least a few non-tech managers map story points to days and assuming story point estimates are written in stones and causing fear and anxiety inside agile teams?
I think story points done well are a tolerable estimate. They're certainly better than a lot of other options. This is not the same as impact. Story points are a measure of difficulty, not impact. So like one, it's an estimate. It's never going to be perfect. 2, you can't grade people on how many story points they got through, because like that's an activity measure, not a value measure. I did this many motions is not the same as I produced a useful thing. So like, all things considered, I would rather that we have story points as a mechanism, but treat them only for what they actually represent.
True.
First, thank you for bringing these topics to front stage. It's good to see I'm not the only one thinking about this. My question is about the documentation evidence that you cited. Do you have any numbers? Is it the same for large and for small teams?
The DORA research tends to be very relatively small team sizes, because it's not you fill out the DORA survey once per organization. It's you fill out the DORA survey once per team. And so it's kind of whatever your definition of team and team success looks like. And so I think statistically, it's mostly going to be relevant for pizza-sized teams, 2 pizza teams. So I think it's mostly we're talking about frontline sorts of groups, development teams. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks.
Yeah.
First off, kudos on a great keynote.
Thank you.
So during meetings, especially Zoom meetings, I find a senior person will say, we're going to do this, here's why. Do you all agree? And then there's dead silence. Now, a lot of times I will speak up and I will say, yes, I agree, and here's why. But I don't want to just do that because I don't want to intimidate other people going, well, if 2 senior people say it's right, then it must be right.
Yeah.
That's certainly not true of the things I can bring up.
Yeah.
But how do you encourage the more timid, shy people to speak more? Because when we meet in person, which is once or twice a year because we're geographically diverse,
Yeah.
that doesn't happen. But on Zoom, like I can't even tell, because you're not seeing people. There's no visual cues.
Yeah. I think learning to navigate remote work settings and doing all of our work over Zoom, and that is challenging. I think it takes a lot more effort from leaders and senior people to actively bring voices in and actively try to build relationships and communication pathways and all of that. And for that, my recommendation would be, you want to get to the point where it is okay for that person not to say, does anyone have any concerns with this, but to say, I haven't heard from you, and you lately. What's at the top of your mind? Like, believable, not believable? No wrong answer. But they have to, like, at first, that by itself is going to be terrifying, right? Because, oh no, the boss is asking, like, and so like that, just getting up to the point where you can normalize that requires some of the rest of the psychological safety team building activity. Because I don't think you can just start with like, this is the first change that we're making to how we communicate. Because I think that's just going to be really terrifying for junior folks. Does that help?
Definitely. Thanks, Titus.
Thanks, Evan.
Hello. So you started your talk by saying that being a good person matters more than being a programmer, which I definitely agree. But what is your take on the fact that most companies, not all of them, of course, don't take that into account in the interview process, being that by focusing on whiteboard interviews or exercise that take days to complete, and how that can impact this build-up or fear over time inside the company after you hire someone?
I don't think that there's anything to be. I'm not sure that we're doing technical interviews correctly at all, right? Like, there's a whole rant. Peter and I have been having this discussion for a little while. Oh, jeez. So, I cannot prove any of this, but my strong hypothesis is we have decided that we like whiteboard coding and leet code problems because if you are hiring junior engineers, new grads, only the people that did leet code contests spent extra hours coding during their degree work, right? And so if your job is to find who has more hands-on keyboard time, asking those types of questions for new grads makes a lot of sense. And then all of the rest of the nonsense from the end of this talk kicks in, and the organization says, well, if those are the things that we're asking, and those are objective questions for new grads, let's do the same thing for everybody, completely ignoring the fact that that was a proxy for how many hours of practice do you have, not this has anything to do with your job, right? And you get terrible results. I have said for a bunch of years, like in team fit interviews, or interviews for specific roles on my team, I'm giving at least as much credit to, do you seem like a good person? Like, we're going to talk about what your values are and things like that. Because I can train you to be a great engineer. I do not know how to train you to be a good person, right? I can hopefully model good behavior and you'll get there, but it's really hard. I would be much, much happier if the industry at large shifted away from whiteboard stuff and leet code problems towards code review. Code review is an appropriate interview question, right? Because then it's, hey, I have written this code. We're going to role play. I have written this code. Please review it as if you were someone on my team, right? Now, if you have done this well, you have the chance to identify, can they tell the difference between a bug and, well, that's not the way that I would do it. There's an efficiency issue here. You dig into some language depth if you want. You get some style questions. But also, importantly, you're role-playing a potentially fraught, challenging moment in the dynamics between two teammates, right? If they can give you, critique without making you feel bad, right? That is relevant signal to doing the job. Code review is relevant signal to doing the job. Reversing a linked list has nothing to do with anything, right? So, I don't know. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Let's do that. Hello, thank you for the human talk. I have to ask, Titus Winters?
Yes.
Is that your D&D character name?
No, that
Okay,
would work.
that's my character name. Kidding. I have a rather controversial question. Do you think that, what's your stance of programmers forming a union? Would that be beneficial to making better productivity, culture, and other things?
I think the history says yes, maybe briefly.
Brief.
Like, I'm all for unionization and workers' rights. Like, I think that there's a lot that could be said and done and improved and all of that. That said, I have also seen, like, there are a lot of unions that wind up as either the power-oriented or the, rules-oriented sort of environment, and you don't actually get the good outcome that we were, fighting for in the first place. And so, like, yeah, it's controversial.
Yep.
Thanks for setting me up there. But, like,
Yep.
I certainly think that we should be looking into it and have that as a potential option, but it's not an obvious yes or no.
Okay, so let's make AI form a union.
Thanks for the talk, because fear's been on my mind a lot recently. Everything from the world to a mean YouTube comment I got last week, and tying so many interesting things together under that topic. I'm just curious, what inspired you for the content of this talk?
It has been on my mind a lot. But also, like I said, I have been intending to use stages like this to hit social and teamwork and leadership issues, more heavily. And pandemic kind of screwed up my speaking schedule a little bit. And I think the only other time that I had a particularly good opportunity, there was a not entirely technical, but technical-ish idea that I was still trying to work out. And I was using the talk. That was the ACCU talk 2 years ago, trade-offs in the software workflow. I should have used that stage to say these things, but I was fascinated by a problem that I was chewing on.
That happens.
But no, I feel like it's your responsibility. It's, someone that has a modicum of respect in the community. I hope I didn't just lose all of that, to do this type of work.
Well, thanks for doing it.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you for this great keynote. Really awesome. But I do also have a few more questions. So, Hani Sukasan asks, kudos to Titus. Really a talk from the heart. What are your thoughts on people who chase visibility, gaining recognition, whereas people who really deserve those credits remain hidden inside teams? How to improve visibility to those deserving people in the teams?
I think that it's Kudos does a lot for that. Adopting the Kudos ritual is a really good way to normalize having other people, call out yeah, that was great. That was important. That mattered. Because, like we said, managers are going to look at what makes a lot of light and heat, what causes a lot of noise, not necessarily the things that matter the most. I am the type of person that has literally said the most important, most impactful thing I did in my career last year was asking a question. In this context, that's a loaded question because the question was 2018, and it was in ISO, and it was, when are we breaking ABI? And that had some ramifications, right? But like, because productivity is never stopping, right? The fact that that's the most important thing I did that year that's not what I got credit for. I got credit for doing 20,000 code reviews or whatever. So.
Yeah, we're still waiting for breaking RB.
It's too late now. You can't.
So
It's too late.
there's a question from Jean Franz René. Thank you, Titus, for a wonderful and unexpected talk. What about consistent feedback? Do you think it adds tremendous values that team members meet and give each other's feedback on technical and soft skills? Or is the managers or team leaders' jobs only to take on that responsibility?
Going back to the survey results of 88% of managers think they can do that and 24% of engineers think that that's appropriate. I will take way more feedback from peers and take that seriously than necessarily from managers. Like, the manager feedback matters. You do have to listen to that, and if it's true, good. And if it's wrong, now you have a new task, which is fixing that perception. But again, feedback is a blessing only in an environment where you actually trust the people around you. If the people around you are strangers or scary or daunting and you're afraid that they're whispering to your manager that you're a terrible person and a bad engineer and should be fired, feedback from those people is going to be very triggering, right?
True.
So we have to start with the very basic things of just build up that trust and safety in whatever mechanism we can, and then we can start doing the things that matter, right?
Yep.
Hi, Titus. I am wondering if you think there's a healthy amount of fear in a team, in the sense of how does accountability comes into play?
Yeah, actually, accountability does matter. It's really funny. I remember where this slide is. This image comes up a lot when we talk about the Google work. Everyone talks about the first one. Dependability is the second one, right? You actually do the things that you said you were going to do, right? You were assigned this task, you said you're going to do it, you did it, right? Turns out no one ever actually even looks at 3, 4, and 5, because if you get number 1 and 2 right, you've already won. It's really hard to get the rest of it wrong. But you have to get number 1 right before you get number 2, right? And dependability means you will get those things done, you are bought into the task, it is reliable. It doesn't have to be through fear, right? It's through pride or challenge or commitment or whatever, not out of fear that you're going to be judged or lose your job.
Sure, but just to kind of add on to that, what about leadership accountability though? It's upwards dependability, I guess, in this case.
Say more?
This kind of assumes that this is dependability between equals, to my mind. But I'm we have leaders, and then sometimes they set the direction, they set the tone, and then often you end up with leaders that don't hold any accountability for those. And I guess fear would make
as
it work.
in they say you need to do this, and then they don't follow up, or as in they aren't being held accountable for their decisions.
Yes, exactly.
The latter one?
Sorry?
That they aren't being held accountable for their decisions?
Yes, exactly. That second one.
Yeah. I now, having said it all out loud to people, so it hits a little different, in the bits about taxonomy and reductive sort of legibility and org structure, I think especially when you start getting into companies that are hundreds or thousands of people, I think we have a lot of this trouble, right? Because for as much as the frontline engineers don't feel like their manager has visibility, I don't know how senior director is judging a director's work. What? Like, what visibility do you have into any of that? So yeah, like I think that there are substantial weirdnesses and concerns in how these things play out, and we would probably do substantially better by taking a good hard look at how we run management for an organization. Yeah.
Thank you for the answer.
Yeah.
Thank you, Titus, for this important keynote. Let me take the opportunity to come back to one technical aspect of your talk, which is backward compatibility in C++.
Okay.
Because you brought it up in an interesting context, which was we have fear, too much fear to break compatibility.
It's too late now.
Too late now. So, did we ever have the chance? I mean, because the question was not can we break, the question was who pays for the price. And if we break as a community, if we drive a thing not as a company or as a project, but as a community, then the people at Microsoft and GCC, etc., have to pay the price for all the calls complaining about broken code. So isn't there something wrong? Or isn't it an inherent problem of the way we standardize instead of fear?
I wasn't necessarily, the specific point that I made was there are two ways to fail at sustainability, like our ability to change. One is not necessarily fear. One is we went through a one-way door. The other is this is a haunted graveyard. I don't think that our backwards compatibility issues or ABI issue is necessarily out of fear. I think that there are very valid technical points to argue on either side. I do think that it's a side effect of that touches on the later part of the talk, right? We standardize the language specification, which is not the ecosystem, right? All modern languages have an ecosystem that is run by the same people, except for C++, right? And that, I think, is a critical gap that changes what flexibilities we have. Like, I do think that in 2019, we could have maybe taken a slight, 2020, the Prague meeting. We could have taken a slightly bolder move and made a big community effort to make everyone know what was coming and why it was coming and all of those things. We didn't. And now, hey, it's the first talk in a while. I haven't said Hiram's Law. We have 10 or 15 years of Hiram's Law dependencies on ABI on every platform, right? This is half of the length of the history of our language, right? You can't change that out from under people. It's too late. Like, we should just, the game is now, how much can we do in a stable environment?
This is no longer a talk where you didn't mention the law.
I know. Well, I didn't mention it in the slides. Yeah.
Hi. Thanks for the great talk. And I have a question regarding documentation.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard some arguments like no one really reads the documentation, and which makes sense sometimes because if you just ask some subject matter expert regarding something, you might get the answer in 5 seconds. But if you get a link that you need to scroll down for like 1 minute, that maybe cause you for like several minutes or several days to figure out what's the true answer. So, but I also agree, please correct me if I paraphrased your sentence wrong. Documentations contribute the culture as well. So I agree with that, but I'm not sure what's the right timing to initiate a documentation about some specific topics, and what's the right what's the criteria of a documentation that really contributes the key point for the culture.
So I think the documentation that influences culture is going to be the stuff by the team for the team, by and large. It's your onboarding docs, your how do I do this task docs.
Right.
It's team working agreement things, it's all of those. As far as the rest of documentation, and to your point about like I could just ask someone or I could read something, the difference there kind of is, can you just ask someone? Is the topic small enough that that's appropriate, right? For facts and trivia and rote sort of like, I need to accomplish X, just tell me how to do X, right? Those are things that probably are not going to be as high value for documentation because, yeah, you either know it or you know someone that knows it, and you just ask, and it's not so bad. For concepts, like what's the difference between a good test and a bad test? Like, you're not going to get that in 5 seconds over chat, right? I think the technical documentation that matters the most are the conceptual pieces that explain how does our team think about this, right? And you don't need to write those yourself. Hopefully you can find decent ones of those. They're not on Medium, because that's mostly AI-generated nonsense at this point. There's a couple good things on Medium, but like you need to. Not everything that can be written down is the same, right? There are how-tos, there are like tutorials, there's getting started, there's conceptual material, there's best practice ideas, there's what are our rules, right? And you can't treat all of those the same, right? Find the ones that matter a lot and focus on those. I really like it when teams identify docs, especially conceptual material, that they're like, this is the standard that we're holding ourselves to. This is the way that we think about this. These are appropriate, authorities. So that, especially in code review or in design review, if your team lead is like, oh, it looks like you are having this misconception. If you have agreed on what are reasonable, authoritative, conceptual docs, then your team lead can be like, please go read X and come back to me in an hour or later in the day or whatever, and that'll be great. And if they don't have access to those explainers, then they're forced to either just let you do the thing that you were doing wrong or try to figure out how to explain it on the fly. And not everyone is a writer or an educator or expert on that particular topic, so you're probably going to get just let it go. This is not a recipe for success. Does that help at all?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Right.
Right. Hope you're not tired of hearing this, but thank you for this talk.
I was not joking. I was very afraid of this talk, so I appreciate it.
Yeah. So shortly, I feel like I'm kind of going through the mid-career crisis where I realized that as much as I enjoy C++ as a tool, it's not enough. I need something more, and I'm really glad this slide is on because this impact part is very important and this human aspect, and I'm very looking forward to Kate's talk, the aging programmer. But now for my question, you cited these studies, and I feel like people have been posting this on LinkedIn for ages now about the culture and even this quote, hire a good person, you can teach them to be a good engineer and stuff. It's been around for a while, and yet nothing really changes. So what can we do?
The next time that one of these decisions is being made, have a conversation with your manager. Do we want to do better? Or do we want to do what everyone else is doing? I think that there's a lot to be said for just asking these questions openly and honestly. And that's going to be a little scary at first. But from what I've seen, most people do want to do better. They're just kind of looking for permission to do better. And if you, I don't know your manager, I don't know you, but I'm going to take a swing and say your manager was probably not given any specific or substantial training in how to be a manager or a leader, because I know that that's the case in a lot of the technical world. And they're just as anxious about doing a novel, weird thing as you would be or anyone else, right? And so broaching those things, bringing it up, be like, hey, we've seen all of the studies. This is supposed to, this can go better. Do we want to use this as a test case and see if it's, see if we get a different result? Seems like a reasonable thing to ask.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm back with some online questions. So, Guillaume Dua asks, junior developer often suffer from imposter syndrome.
I suffer from imposter syndrome.
Yet are required to immediately generate value. So using LLMs is a tempting option as a tool to help them deliver. Using LLMs as a truth source results in poor quality, buggy code, and endless code review process. Any advices?
The other community where I feel safe is computer science education. And the CS Ed community is having a slow crisis over generative AI. Because, we'll be honest, the first half of an undergraduate degree can absolutely be automated by ChatGPT. And how do we actually get people to practice the ways of thinking that are necessary to be an algorithmic thinker when you can synthesize the entire answer to the question, right? And my really hot take in that space is we probably need to stop pretending that CS is a funny form of math, where we can ask math problems with mechanical correct answers, and admit the thing that we've been saying for 30 years, that this is a craft. And if you asked, don't give people algorithmic assignment of take this input, generate this output. Give them the assignment, create something beautiful. Let's, as a class, evaluate both the output, how that program executes, as well as the code itself, right? Let's learn to read and critique each other's code, right? Treat it like art studio or architecture, hopefully with less of the toxicity. But I don't see how else we actually can incentivize that they play around with it and spend time on understanding without foolishly trying to forbid the use of generative AI, because they're going to use it. Not only are they going to use it, they should use it. I have Copilot installed in my IDE.
But I do think that is a problem that every form of input has now, that people just submit stuff they generated and then things maybe not match the expectations.
Yeah, and the value of an education in CS and the role of junior engineers, I think, is increasingly going to focus on understanding and debugging and not code production. And we have never taught understanding or reading or critique or debugging. We've only ever taught sit down and code and pretend that it's correct the first time. And both the junior engineers as well as the whole academic world are going to fall apart, because we have to make this shift, and I don't see how we make it. It will get worse before it gets better, because we will have to wait until the crisis peaks.
Yeah. One more question. Thank you very much for your insights. I tend to agree with most of your statements, but I'm always concerned with arbitrariness, especially in large teams, says Stefano Chiasso. how can we avoid that knowing that not everything is quantifiable?
How can we avoid
How can we
arbitrariness?
avoid that knowing that not everything is quantifiable?
I think that's how do we avoid the arbitrariness
Yes.
when we know that not everything is quantifiable. Like we have to accept that we are operating on imperfect information. And just because it becomes measurable and you can take an average of it does not make it the full story. Yeah, some of it's going to be arbitrary. Some of it's going to be under-justified. Some of it's going to be whatever. But we need to, I think my point is mostly, don't pretend that we know all of it, accept that some of it is just going to be what it is, and try to gather a more holistic gestalt sort of understanding of the environment that you're operating in when you have the luxury to do so. I hope I understood that and answered that appropriately.
Hi, first of all, thanks for the talk. It's an important subject. So my question is, how do some of the different things that you mentioned combine? Because the very colorful picture that says that you sometimes work with people not necessarily that share the same lead with you. So how would that interact with trying to get them kudos? How do the kudos reach them eventually? And also maybe on the code review where you maybe have standards of way of doing the code review, and then maybe you don't have the same standards or values across larger teams.
Right. As far as kudos for people off the team, certainly one of the things that I miss most about having been at Google is Google's peer bonus system. It's like, if someone has done an extra good job, if they went above and beyond, send them a bonus. It's like $100, $150. And then you get public gratitude. These are good for us. And they see that that work was not invisible, and their manager gets CC'd. If, as most of us, are not in an environment where peer bonus is an option, you can still send an email or a quick Slack message or whatever to a manager. I have been a manager most of the time for the last 10 plus years. If someone interrupts me or bothers me on Slack or email to say, hey, your report did a great job here, that's a great day. Like, that is the best interrupt possible, right? Like, don't be afraid of other people's managers. Don't be afraid of saying good things. Like, just be like, no response needed, just so you know, Bob and Sue did a great job this week. They helped me on all of these things. Does that help?
Yep, thanks.
Hi. First of all, thank you for your very insightful talk. I have the following question. So, given the fact that we had this period of COVID when a lot of people, well, most people needed to work from home, have you noticed some cultural shift in regards in how everything works, especially having worked for many years? Do you think that, well, presumably there is a new generation of people, new junior people who just went through university and then they pretty much started working like they did before, somewhat individually. Yeah. Do you think some culture was lost there? Are we recovering it from it? So,
like, it was absolutely lost. Again, I can cite my friend Sierra Jaspin. The research from Google's EngProd research group said, surprisingly, the work from home era was actually a boon for productivity for senior folks and was an abomination for junior folks because they do not have that acculturation. They do not have that just look around and be like, oh, that guy is browsing the web, not hacking. Let me go ask him my question. They don't have any of those like easy social cues. They're not sitting there at their desk, clearly like frustrated and on the verge of tears, looking at a compiler message. So the people on their team can't just drop by and be like, hey, let's fix this, right? Doing the job of a junior engineer remotely, man, that is basically impossible, right? And I don't, like, it really has to fall to team leads and managers to make really active, aggressive moves to try to, like, build them into, like, grow them in their career, build them into the team, like, mesh, so that they have no friction in, hey, I'm stuck on this. But that's hard, like, especially people you haven't met in person, right? We're used to having social dynamics of, like, we went to lunch together, we've had a beer together, right? We're used to having understanding that is a person, and especially if you've only ever seen them as a face on a Zoom call, like, yeah, we don't have that depth to lean on yet. I think, I mean, we can't put the genie back in the bottle. Like, hybrid work is going to be here for a while, and there's going to be a bunch of weird, important things that come out of, okay, how do we support junior folks? Which we probably should have been doing a better job of pre-pandemic, but now it's on fire, and exacerbated by ChatGPT and Copilot and all of that stuff. Like, man, it's got to be really rough to be a 25-year-old in tech right now. Like, so, does that help at all?
Yes, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Hi. Kudos for the fantastic talk and pushing through your anxieties. It's my first time asking a question of a keynote speaker. And it's kind of a broad one. So, how do you fix an environment where people start losing trust in the organization, having their best interest in mind, and check out emotionally because they encounter pushback and burnout trying to change things? What hope do you have for such an organization?
I left. And unfortunately, I think that that's the right answer. And the hard part is it will take a little while to leave. Like, the best advice that I ever got from a friend, maybe not best, but very good advice, was it is much better to be running towards something than running away from it. And this is actually part of why I think it's really valuable to constantly be on the lookout for, like, are there other jobs? Are there other opportunities? Like, I'm happy here, right? But it could change almost overnight. And having some ideas of what you could escape to, having an exit strategy. Years ago, I would have been like, you know, we do great when we commit and we hang in there and fight the good fight. And there are times when, no, you do have to take care of yourself. You do have to put your mask on first, all of those things. But because of how long and hard that process can be, you don't want to wait until it's life or death and you are burned out, because it will be extra work to also find something. So you need to have enough awareness to be like, hey, this is trending in a way that I'm not comfortable with. I'm going to start putting out some feelers, see what's up. I hope that helps. It's not as satisfying as I would like it to be, but that's been my experience.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah.
So, Online World has another question. Philip Hempel asks, you mentioned that monkey meeting where people talk about their biggest mistakes of the week.
Yep.
I absolutely love that idea, and I'm thinking about promoting something like this in my team.
Mm-hmm.
How do you make sure people do not fear exposing themselves, making dumb mistakes?
At first, it's hard. Like, the first couple times around, you're going to get either kind of awkward silence or some kind of incremental things like, oh, I was too busy. But especially in conjunction with the kudos exercise and trying to like build up recognition of the rest of your team as people and like having intrinsic worth as humans and things. The monkey part takes a little longer, but is at least as important to get right. And one of the interesting things as a leader is when my teams are all giving me like kind of bland monkeys, this is telling me that we're not pushing hard enough or aiming high enough. Because if we can do the job of 5 or 10 people without messing anything up in a week, we need to be doing more. And so it's actually a useful like feedback mechanism for leadership as well in that sense. And then just leadership needs to lead on those things. Like find something that you screwed up and make it clear that you are okay with all sorts of these stories. The story that I remember most about me claiming the monkey was I have trouble sleeping. I have anxiety stuff. And I was unrelatedly trying to get into the habit of taking a daily vitamin in the morning. And so one morning, I get up and I go to the medicine cabinet and I take a pill. And then I realize that was the sleepy pill, not the vitamin pill. And I'm like, well, I could pretend that I am not severely compromised and try to get through my day, or I could use this as a demonstration of, hey, team, bad news, I have just roofied myself. I will probably not be online today. And in the end of the week, I claimed the monkey, and everyone was like, yeah, you screwed that up real good. So, you know, lead by example.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that. So, Minea Magyaru asks, thank you for the talk, Titus. Considering a scenario where there's already a massive written documentation, but which tends to be hard to find something specific you're interested in, would that be your take on training an LLM on that massive docs have that got asked?
Yeah, I cannot tell you how many people have been like, we don't need to work on docs, LLMs will do it. I was like, I've seen your wiki. All of that information is out of date. So if we go back to the mindset of lossy compression over the input corpus, right? This is not a magic, incredibly smart engineer that you just hired for free that is going to suss out what the truth is. This is a stochastic parrot. You are going to get garbage in, garbage out, I guarantee it. So yes, if you want your docs and question answering and Stack Overflow equivalent stuff, if you want those things to be better, you can't just magic with LLM. You have to actually go delete the stuff that's wrong and out of date and update the quality of your corpus. And then you have a fancy, excellent UI for extracting information from that corpus. But it's not a silver bullet. You have to go do the work and fix the underlying corpus. I haven't gotten anyone to actually do that work because we just want a silver bullet in this industry.
Yeah. That's I think a point that we need to actually have a role for technical writers and hire people to keep things up to date.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the talk. Oh, it's crazy. It's okay, I need to concentrate. About the fear part, I wanted to ask a question about this. We were talking about LLMs a lot, but we were not talking about the public pressure on C++ in general. That C++ is like an unsafe language, and that no work should be done in C++ anymore or C. Yeah. And as I am, and most likely a lot of other people in here, invested a lot of years in learning C++ to the amount they can.
You have invested a lot of years in learning how to be an excellent programmer and systems thinker. You happen to also be good at C++.
Yeah. Yeah, I was, okay. Yeah. Thanks.
I mean, it sounds trite, but like I really mean it. The two gentlemen that succeeded me as being the team lead for Google's C++ library team also left the company. And they have a Rust startup. They did not learn Rust until like 6 months ago. And they're like, yeah, this is great. Like so much of my, like the syntax doesn't transfer over, but like, it's not like I don't know how memory layout works and all of these things, right? Like, yeah, you take a 2-month hit on like, oh, this feels like I'm programming through Jello, right? Like, and then snaps into focus and it's just another language. So the language is a tool, man. Like, just because you love your, power saw from the 70s doesn't mean we can't get a new power saw and you're still good at saws. That's fine.
So it's an analogous answer to the answer, if your management is not doing right, maybe change the company. Or would you say there's still future in C++ from your perception?
There is.
Because, it sounded a little bit like, okay, maybe jump the boat.
Yeah, no. There is 50 billion lines of important C++ code out there, right? There will be use of C++ for at least a decade or two, right? That said, I think here in the EU, if I understood the news reports from this week, software providers in the next 2 or 3 years will be financially liable for any harm that happens because of crashes, defects, or compromise, right? Find me a file parser or a network endpoint that is not compromisable, right? 2/3 or 3/4 of bugs come from memory safety vulnerabilities. There's no research that has said otherwise. You can write safe C++. You can write, web browser in assembly. Technically, these are true statements. My money is on don't panic, but start looking around. But you got 5-10 years. It is not a run for the exits by any means, but it'd be nice to have a little bit of diversity. So is that okay?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Last one, apparently. I have a question about the legibility and top-down approach, because what happened in our team is that the top-down thinking is so entrenched that it's become a habit where every team member winds up expecting stuff to be organized from the top down. Do you have any advice or rituals for trying to break out of that habit?
I mean, there's a difference between having organization and having someone that is in charge, like having someone that knows what the requests from a customer are from the other department or the whatever, right? There's a difference between there exists a hierarchy and people in charge versus you were just told what to do, right? I think good leadership is a lot of, hey, I've talked with people from other places and I think that we have these problems. Does that seem believable? Would you like to fix any of these for us? Right? Like that, to my mind, is good leadership. Like, hey, our product seems to be missing X, Y, and Z. We've done some user studies, or the product designers came up with these new ideas. Is this exciting? Do you buy it? Right? If your leadership comes in and says, do it this way, right? That's a failure of leadership. Like, I hold myself to, I get 1 every 2 years ability to tell a report, you will do it this way. And that is an absolute failure on my part. And I usually don't wind up having to use that credit. because you're going to get better work if you can motivate them to understand what's the problem that they're trying to solve and have their buy-in that they want to solve it. And then it's not, I'm just ordering you to do it. It's, I dangled a carrot, you took the bait, we're in agreement, you do your part, and I will feed you new problems next week. Does that make any sense?
It makes sense. I suspect I saw a problem we don't have. But it was interesting to hear from the other perspective.
Yeah.
Effectively.
And then from
If you can,
from ground up, like
if feedback arrives at the leadership, then or
Sure.
suggestions arrives at the leadership, then that's a sign of a healthy environment.
I think so. And you need to, like, it is on your leaders and your manager to make sure that they have enough, trust and respect with you that you can ask them probing questions. Like, that doesn't smell right. Like, why are we doing that? And if they get real uppity about the fact that you're questioning them, then you know which of those Westrum cultures you're in and should either act accordingly or flee the ship. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, just thank you for answering all the questions. And thank you for asking all the questions. I have another one. And I think it's a good one. Hani Sukasan asks, do you suggest any other good books or your favorite, you mentioned Accelerate, that you think as a must-watch read as software engineers talking about these topics?
I mean, I have a biased answer to that. I do like my book for a lot of these topics. Let's see. There is a book called Thinking in Systems that I think is really valuable for the title. That is much more like technical, but is a good reminder of like sort of abstract systems thinking stuff. I've been hitting a lot more sort of leadership books and organizational dynamics things. I really enjoyed Turn the Ship Around by David Marquette, getting a thumbs up in the crowd. There's a couple quotes in that are just absolutely haunting. To the diversity and inclusion aspects of all of this, as well as the productivity aspects of this, I like Just Work, which is the follow-up from the same author as Radical Candor. And she has described it as a little bit of an apology for Radical Candor does assume a certain amount of power, whereas Just Work kind of is a little bit more holistic, but does make a lot of the same points about fear and productivity and like that these things, that this all works together. Otherwise, I'm kind of drawing a blank. I tend to go for a lot more talks and essays than full books. But
okay. Yeah, there's also
I think there's a suggestion behind
the meta question, which I think we will provide later, like the links and essays you've based your keynote on.
Yeah.
Kann ich noch eine Frage stellen? When managers fear that juniors may surpass them and they don't like to upbring the juniors to be a better person or engineer, how to handle this behavior?
Get a different manager. Go to their manager and tell on them.
Yeah.
Raise questions with HR about is the job of a manager to avoid making waves, or is the job of a manager to ensure that their people grow and that the work gets done? I go back to this people grow thing a lot, which brings up another classic Titus anecdote. I was doing a book club reading of Mythical Man Month, which I cite a lot and it still has a lot of value in it. I hate that the language is so unnecessarily gendered. And God comes into it a lot, which is kind of weird for an engineering text, but there is still a lot of wisdom in it. There is one chapter in it that I still think is complete nonsense, which is the surgical team, which the idea of the surgical team is, for your project, you should get the absolute best person to do all of the work, and everyone else is just support, to build the tools and API infrastructure and whatever to support that person, just in the same way that in a surgical, like, operating theater, you have the head surgeon and you have everyone else that is just kind of supporting them. And that made sense in the 70s when we were playing software as a one-off game, right? If you know the difference between one-shot Prisoner's Dilemma and iterated Prisoner's Dilemma, there's a different optimal strategy, right? For one-shot Prisoner's Dilemma, defect is unfortunately the optimal strategy. For iterated Prisoner's Dilemma, you can prove tit for tat is the optimal strategy, which is always collude until the other person defects, and then defect the number of times they did, right? So you always hit them back equivalently. You don't escalate, whatever. Anyway, that's a game theory thing. But the difference between modern software and software in the 70s is, in the 70s, we thought of this as a one-shot game. Now we are playing an iterated game, right? And in an iterated game, the optimal strategy for task assignment is not have the best person do it. It's have the most junior person do it that can do it with some modicum of supervision, because that is the only way that we ensure that we are better next year, and it frees up the best person to go handle a thing that we don't know how to handle yet. Like, substantially better strategy. But this only works in an environment where we focus on growth, and importantly, your managers are being evaluated on whether or not they got their people to grow. If their managers are not causing them to grow, that is a terrible manager.
That's true.
Yeah.
I still have two book recommendations. One is Jonathan Smart, Sooner Safe Happier, and Amy Edmondson, Fearless Organization.
Fearless Organization. Yep. Okay. Thank you.
That brings us to, well, basically we have lunch now. So thank you for your keynote. Very, very awesome. I loved it.